Last week, I sent out a tweet and people got pretty upset with me, okay? I said, I understand Patrick Mahomes is good at football, but Kadarius Tony may be the worst pick in fantasy football drafts right now. And yeah, blew up, had almost 300,000 views and a measly 300 likes. And a lot of people telling me that, of course, I am an idiot and that Kadarius Tony has such a high ceiling, blah, blah, blah. I want to tell you exactly why you need to be avoiding Kadarius Tony in drafts this season. And then also look at the opposite end. Like, what is the real upside? What is the real probability Kadarius Tony goes out there and finishes as a top 20 wide receiver this next season? But before we get into it, you better be dropping a like on this video. You better be subscribed to the channel if you play fantasy football. And of course, if you play fantasy football, you are going to love flogfantasy.com, where we already wrote this as an article over there. But also on flogfantasy.com, you can find my fantasy football rankings, the fantasy football rankings of all your favorite content creators, plus so much premium content. And when you sign up with promo code FLOCK, you're going to get 30% off any subscription. And also with promo code FLOCK, yours truly will go through and break down your fantasy football team in a podcast. But I think that should be about it. And before we talk about Kadarius Tony's in-depth statistics, before we go advanced here, let's look at the basics, right? This is a wide receiver that his rookie season finishes as the wide receiver 68 from a per game perspective. Now, not going to lie to you. In 2022, I wasn't saying, oh, okay, Kadarius Tony was bad his rookie season. Let's go through and let's avoid. He couldn't stay healthy. No, I looked at the Kadarius Tony profile and went, oh my gosh, okay. Well, yeah, we have a very, very small sample to look at with Kadarius Tony. But hell, he did go out there and average 42 yards a game as a rookie. And the most exciting thing by far with Kadarius Tony, his rookie season, was his 2.2 yards per route run. So we were able to sit here and go, okay, well, yeah, he goes out there, he averages almost 6 targets a game. He actually has 42 receiving yards a game, which isn't great, but 2.2 yards per route run, that puts him up in the top tier of elite wide receivers in the NFL, right? But the main issue is it was off an extremely small sample, where we know when you're looking at small samples, you can actually skew statistics and they can go a little out of whack. What we needed to see with Kadarius Tony is continued improvement going into year 2, make the sample size larger. That way we can have some clear takeaways with Kadarius Tony. Well, Tony didn't necessarily deal with injuries through the entire course of the Kansas City Chiefs season this past year. I mean, Kadarius Tony did go out there and he played about 7 games, but we also saw him in the playoffs. So if you're just looking at the regular season statistics, a little bit skewed. But if we're talking about skewed statistics, the main reason why people are going to be looking at the exciting, quote unquote, profile that Kadarius Tony has going into this next year is that yards per route run was still sky high. 2.8 yards per route run, which was phenomenal. But if you're looking at the basic numbers, he was the wide receiver 92 from a points per game perspective. Yeah, so that's not startable. He was averaging about 2 targets a game, about 28 receiving yards on a per game basis. But people are ignoring those basic numbers. And trust me, I was there his rookie year as well. I wanted to make excuses for him as an injured rookie. But if we are diving in a little bit deeper to those advanced numbers where people are very excited, you're going to see how you could be deceived. Because at 2.8 yards per route run, you were looking at an elite class of players. The only wide receivers to average 2.8 yards per route run this past season with a minimum of 45 targets going in the direction were Tyreek Hill, Justin Jefferson, A.J. Brown. The guys right behind that were Jalen Waddle, Stephon Diggs, Cooper Kupp, Christian Watson, Devontae Adams, CeeDee Lamb, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Chris Olave. So the who's who of wide receiver, you're looking at only elite level wide receivers on that list. Now the issue, right, is those were guys that were able to have 45 targets this past season. So we are looking at real samples there. Well, Kadarius Tony did not come close to 45 targets. Kadarius Tony was at a measly 17. So if we're going to go through and lower the bar to get Kadarius Tony in here, well, you know what? Who is right up there at the very top of yards per route run this past season is Laviska Shenault. Oh my gosh, Laviska Shenault. 3.3 yards per route run, tied number 1 in the NFL with Tyreek Hill. He goes out there and he has almost double the amount of targets that Kadarius Tony has. So you're almost looking at double the sample here. He has 32 targets over there in Carolina. Now, should the takeaway be, okay, yeah, Laviska Shenault's intriguing. We need to be going out there and drafting Shenault this season. No, that's not the takeaway at all. The takeaway is, okay, limited sample. Maybe he was used in gimmicky ways. Maybe he's more so a jackknife type player that's not going to be a true typical wide receiver one that we can start in fantasy. Oh, that kind of sounds like Laviska Shenault. If we go over and look at some other guys, you have Derrick Henry on this list. You have the rookie tight end in Tennessee. Are we sitting here thinking he's going to turn into the next Travis Kelce? Nope. You're looking at a limited sample. You're looking at this list with Rashid Shaheed as a wide receiver that nobody's excited about going into this next year. You have Kadarius Hodgins in freaking Atlanta. I mean, we have Rashad Bateman here as well. What we have to understand is if you are looking at that limited sample, you are going to get options in here that are not quality fantasy names. So we shouldn't just look at that one statistic off a very small sample size and say, if this guy was to get a full season, if this guy was to get a full workload, he would dominate. Because in reality, what you may actually have here is you may actually have a little bit more of a gadget type player. Because if you're looking at this past season, Kadarius Tony ran fewer than 9 routes per game for the Kansas City Chiefs. If you're looking at what he did in the playoffs, Kadarius Tony in the Super Bowl wasn't used at all. We all remember the big punt return, but do you remember Kadarius Tony going out there as an every down player for the Kansas City Chiefs offense when all the chips were down, when all the cards were on the table? No, Tony was not out there. He was a special teams guy. And right now, if you were looking at Kadarius Tony's ADP on Underdog, this is a wide receiver that is tied with Dallas Goedert. I am consistently getting Dallas Goedert after Kadarius Tony in drafts. You have Kadarius Tony right in line with Mike Evans, who essentially just prints 1,000-yard seasons. Tyler Lockett. I'm not the biggest Lockett guy this year, but we've seen the production from Tyler Lockett. Jordan Addison, an elite prospect in a great offense. He's going right ahead of Dalvin Cook, DeAndre Swift, George Pickens. In my mind, this is rounds too early. But if I'm looking at the 100-plus teams I'm drafting on Underdog right now, I mean, I think we're 120 in. I have Kadarius Tony in one draft out of like 120, 130. And that's just because he probably fell 2 rounds past ADP. And knowing myself, I was like, okay, if he's fallen 2 rounds past ADP, I'll take anybody. But I haven't drafted him at all on Underdog, and that's a platform where we should be drafting for the highest ceiling possible. I mean, you know, Best Ball Mania, $25 buy-in, $15 million prize pool, $3 million to first place. And of course, if you want to draft on Underdog Fantasy, if you are a sicko that wants to take Kadarius Tony over Dallas Goedert, you can find the link in the description. You can find the link in the comment section. When you sign up for Underdog with promo code FLOCK, you can get into drafts with us every single day on the live stream. Also, with promo code FLOCK, you will get a 100% deposit match and my 2023 fantasy football rankings. But I want to dive a little bit deeper here. So what I did is I headed over to Rotovis, and I wanted to filter all year 2 wide receivers since the year 2000. So we are looking at a massive sample size, right? We are looking at a sample size that has thousands and thousands of wide receivers in it. And I wanted to look at year 2 wide receivers that averaged less than 20 receiving yards per game, that averaged less than 2 receptions per game, and that averaged less than 2.5 targets per game, just like Kadarius Tony, because I want to look at the historical hit rate that you've had with a player like this. And if we're looking at year 2 wide receivers to average that few stats across the board, there are 236 of them in this sample. And now out of those 236, of course, you're going to have some outliers, right? Maybe there was a player that was banged up in year 2 that just got traded like Kadarius Tony, and all of a sudden he goes out there and he finally breaks out in year 3, and it just wasn't fair to him, maybe like you're seeing with Kadarius Tony. 236 is a massive sample. So how many wide receivers do you think you were able to see average more than 70 receiving yards per game in year 3? One guy. And that was in the year 2000. How many wide receivers do you think were able to average over 60 receiving yards per game? 3 guys. How many were able to average over 50 receiving yards per game? 5 out of 236. So if Kadarius Tony were to go out there and average over 50 receiving yards per game this next season, he would be the outlier of all outliers. What is the more likely scenario, right? Because out of those 236, most of them don't do anything the next year. Out of those 236, it wasn't 25 of them that averaged less than 10 yards per game. It wasn't 50 of them. It wasn't 75. It wasn't 100. 159. Over half, well over half of those wide receivers average fewer than 10 receiving yards on a per game basis in their third season. Now, do I think that Kadarius Tony will average fewer than 10 receiving yards per game going into year 3? No, I don't think that, right? I'm realistic here. I understand that Kadarius Tony is a little bit more of an outlier than the majority of the wide receivers on this list, and you should have higher expectations than Kadarius Tony than the average wide receiver on this list, where the average wide receiver on this list averages like 5 to 6 receiving yards his next season. So I think if we are trying to meet ourselves in the middle here, what you're looking at with Kadarius Tony is more so a gadget type player that will be a special teams option for the Kansas City Chiefs that will be in the mix, as we know the Chiefs don't have an alpha wide receiver 1 at this time. We know the Chiefs are just going to spread the ball around, and even if Mahomes goes out there and dominates, just like what we saw this past season, right? Because Patrick Mahomes was my most drafted quarterback out of the 700 plus underdog teams I drafted in 2023. I had him in so many because he was going in the 5th round, and obviously he's the best quarterback in football. Well, he had a phenomenal season. I will tell you that. He won the Super Bowl. And how many wide receivers were productive in Kansas City? 1, kind of. Juju Smith-Schuster went out there and had 58 receiving yards per game. Juju Smith-Schuster had 3 touchdowns. If Kadarius Tony goes out there and is somehow able to turn himself from a gadget hybrid player into the wide receiver 1 for the Kansas City Chiefs, based off what we saw last year with Patrick Mahomes having a phenomenal season, is he worth a pick higher than Dallas Goedert? Is he worth a pick higher than Mike Evans, Tyler Lockett, Kyle Pitts, Dalvin Cook, George Pickens? No, he's not. Okay. And that's almost best case scenario for him here. And worst case scenario is DeAndre Hopkins comes over. Okay. Y'all know DeAndre Hopkins. I've drafted the hell out of him in underdog drafts so far this offseason. A wide receiver that in my mind will be going to a contending team. I think it makes sense. I mean, you've made all your money in Houston. You've made all your money in Arizona. You've been on enough bad teams in your NFL career. I think Hopkins looks to go to KC. I think he looks to go to Buffalo. I think he looks to go to the Jets, the Ravens. And if you look at Las Vegas sportsbooks right now, that's exactly what they're telling us as well. So how does this work out for Tony? Seriously, please go to the comment section and let me know this. Let me know what I am missing. They didn't use him in the playoffs. They didn't use him in the Super Bowl outside of special teams. They've used him as a gadget type player when they had no wide receivers on the Chiefs this past year. Wide receivers that produce like him historically turn into a pumpkin in year 3 because they're not good. I could be making a mistake here. So let me know in the comment section, of course. Make sure you drop a like on this video as well. Subscribe to the channel if you play fantasy football. And if you want to get access to my fantasy football rankings, of course, you can do so by either signing up for flockfantasy.com with promo code FLOCK for 30% off, or you can just go sign up for Underdog Fantasy, get in a draft with us today, use promo code FLOCK for a 100% deposit match and my 2023 rankings. But thank you again. Really do appreciate y'all. Really hope you have a great day, and really hope you hop in an Underdog draft in the live stream with us later today.